Folks, we'll get started here in a minute. We're waiting for Dr. Bashan to come. He's on his way, so he should be here momentarily, and we'll get started. So appreciate everyone's patience. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. This is the joint hearing of the Subcommittee on Oversight and the Subcommittee on Research and Technology, and we'll call this meeting to order. I welcome everyone to today's joint hearing entitled Reducing the Administrative Workload for Federally Funded Research. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. Before we get started, since this is a joint hearing involving two subcommittees, I want to explain how we will operate procedurally so that all members understand how the question and answer period will be handled. We will recognize those members present at the gavel in order of seniority on the full committee, and those coming in after the gavel will be recognized in order of their arrival. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Let me begin by extending a warm welcome to our witnesses and thank you all for appearing today bright and early. In fact, Dr. Lee Glauser, I understand you drove all the way from Syracuse to come today, and we really appreciate your taking all that effort to do so. So I appreciate that hard effort that you made. So welcome all of you. Earlier this year, the National Science Board issued a report that examines concerns raised by educational institutions on the paperwork that's required of each of them when applying for federal funds for research. The report references work done by an association, also represented here today, which identified through a couple of surveys that on average, researchers spend 42% of their application time on meeting administrative requirements. That is a massive drain on researchers' time and resources. It means they are spending that much less time on conducting their active research, which is their primary objective. 42% sounds to me to be an extraordinary high number. I've often spoken against the bureaucracies associated with a large federal government. And it appears that our educational institutions may indeed be victims of bureaucratic red tape. As such, it seems fair to explore solutions such as harmonizing and streamlining federal regulations and reporting requirements. It also makes sense to eliminate ineffective federal regulations while also requiring universities to increase their efficiency and effectiveness. But as with most issues that appear before this committee, there are many sides to consider. And another one of our witnesses today, the Inspector General for the National Science Foundation, will provide us with her perspective as an auditor, which is quite different. While everyone generally agrees that efforts to reduce these administrative burdens should not be at the expense of transparency and accountability, it is the auditor who actually reviews grants for waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. Consequently, I'm interested in learning about not only how the federal government can and needs to do a better job of cutting down red tape to bring that 42% number down, but also about the tools, or in this case, the paperwork the NSF Inspector General needs access in order to do her job effectively. As a physician and a man of science, I can appreciate the value of our nation and to our students of research universities' work to sustain the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics workforce. The United States relies greatly on the strength and success of our universities in order to remain a world leader in science and technology. But it shouldn't be a surprise to most of you that when it comes to spending taxpayer dollars, I have some well-known opinions on how much or how little the federal government should spend and where such funds should go. Don't get me wrong, making sure our science agencies are funded at the appropriate authorization level is important, but it is that definition of appropriate that is critical. If we really want to reduce the administrative burden on institutions, then all we have to do is reduce the size of the administration. No money, no problem. But this is a discussion for another day, of course. I look forward to today's hearing, which I anticipate will inform us on how to reduce the administrative workload for federally funded research without compromising the federal responsibility to ensure tax money is spent in the manner intended. Thank you. And now I recognize my friend and ranking member, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Maffei, for an opening statement. Mr. Maffei, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank my friend and chairman for the not only for recognizing me, but for also holding this hearing. I think this is an extremely important hearing. I'm actually particularly pleased that one of my constituents, Dr. Gina Lee Glauser, is here. And as you mentioned, had to make great personal sacrifice to come down. Central New York isn't as far as Georgia, but it's still quite a drive. Fortunately, we are not in the winter weather where it would have been almost impossible. But I know that the committee will value her advice and insights about all of us thinking about these issues. Regulations can certainly add to the burdens and hurdles of researchers, but we have to weigh the benefits of those regulations against the cost. I want to thank Dr. Birkenstock and Dr. Sedgwick for bringing their thoughtful reports to our attention. Those studies provide plenty of examples of places where we can pare back on the bureaucratic burdens to free up our professors to do the work we really want them to do. I'm also very pleased to have Mrs. Lerner here to tell us what information really is necessary to collect to avoid fraud and wasteful grants. That's so important. With scientists spending 40% of their time perhaps on this paperwork, and I've even seen larger amounts of time, this is an extremely important thing to make sure that we reduce anything unnecessary to allow them to spend more of their time doing science. But I would be, I think, remiss if I didn't bring up that the so much time and energy of a researcher simply comes from applying for grants, the same grant for the same research project over and over and over again. And with 80% of applications for grants going unfunded, even very, very promising proposals are not funded simply because there are insufficient funds. Researchers spend an enormous amount of time chasing money from an increasingly smaller pot. Unfortunately, the first act that we marked up a few weeks ago in the full committee failed to provide an authorization that even matches the already constrained level offered by the appropriators. Now, I'm not trying to be partisan on this. I actually believe the president also has not done enough in terms of funding science and in terms of real buying power, the cost of science. We've seen that the actual funds have gone down for research from the federal government. And by failing to provide more robust funding, I fear that we consign many researchers to hours and hours of unfunded effort that will, 4 out of 5 times, only result in failure. That also constitutes a huge hidden cost. And we need scientists. We need scientists in this country to do the science, not paperwork burdens, not applying again and again and again for the same grant because there's so little funding. Now, I realize there are a lot of burdens obviously on federal funds. But if we don't do it, Mr. Chairman, I fear that, first of all, competitors such as China and others will overtake us very quickly in terms of research on science. But also we are putting our society at a far higher cost. This is a capital investment when we invest in scientific research. It is not the same thing as throwing money out the window. In fact, societies for thousands and thousands of years, even if they had 0 social programs, still invested in scientific research. And those that didn't, did it at their peril. So I'm very, very grateful to you for having this hearing. I think it's very important to reduce the paperwork burden, but I do want to make sure that we put it in the proper context, that it isn't the only thing that's going to solve the problem of scientists spending so much time doing things other than science. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Maffei. Surely not suggesting we get rid of the social programs. as a Democrat.
Surely I'm not. I'm just drawing a comparison, though I do think we could do those more efficiently as well.
Amen, brother. I'll now recognize the chairman of the Subcommittee on Research and Technology, the gentleman from Indiana, medical colleague, Dr. Bashan, for his opening statement. Dr. Bashan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today. Our hearing today on reducing the administrative workload for federally funded research brings forward an important subject for all of us, reducing burdensome red tape caused by an overly entangled bureaucratic web on the research community. Last April, I did a university tour in my state of Indiana, which is home to many premier research universities. At every school I visited, the administrative burden on researchers was of utmost concern. In 2012, the National Research Council produced a report in response to a bipartisan bicameral request highlighting 10 recommendations for the future of U.S. research universities. One of the recommendations from that report was to reduce or eliminate regulations that increase administrative costs, impede research productivity, and deflect creative energy without substantially improving the research environment. In early 2013, I joined the former chair of the Research Subcommittee, my colleague Mo Brooks from Alabama, on a request to the GAO to identify federal requirements that create burden for research universities. To avoid duplication, GAO waited to move forward on our request due to ongoing work of the Office of Management and Budget, the National Science Board, and the Federal Demonstration Partnership. I believe now that these projects have wrapped up and we can expect GAO to begin to identify and address concerns regarding both burden and potential value of regulatory requirements. Additionally, the bill I authored, H.R. 4186, the Frontiers in Innovation, Research, Science, and Technology Act, was reported favorably from the full committee on May 28th and included a provision requiring the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy to establish a working group responsible for reviewing federal regulations surrounding research and research universities and making recommendations on ways to minimize the regulatory burden on universities. I want to make sure we address the concern that 42% of a researcher's time, according to the FDP, is spent on administrative tasks which may take away from the conduct of science. But we must also ensure that we maintain processes to safeguard accountability, transparency, and responsibility in handling taxpayer resources. I'm confident that we are taking thoughtful and beneficial steps toward addressing the issue of the regulatory burden. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today on their experiences, concerns, and suggestions to alleviate this problem while preserving accountability. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Bashan. Now I recognize the ranking member of the Research and Technology Committee, my friend Ron Lipinski. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. Thank you, Chairman Brown and Chairman Bashan, for holding this hearing on reducing administrative workload for researchers. As my prior life as a university professor, researcher, I certainly do have an appreciation for this. There have been numerous reports, including some we will hear about this morning, that have found that researchers face significant administrative burdens, as all of my colleagues have talked about. That is concerning because the time spent on administrative tasks, from applying for grants to submitting progress reports to complying with rules for human participant requirements, is time not spent on conducting research. This could mean a delay in research progress and lengthening the time for the next scientific breakthrough. I want to stress that many administrative requirements are very important. We must have a system that ensures that federal resources are not being wasted and that human participants are being protected. That being said, we need to find the right balance that meets those goals and allows researchers to focus on what they do best, advancing science. I am concerned that we might not be striking the appropriate balance. If researchers are spending over 40% of their time on administrative tasks and not research, that is wasteful. At a hearing in 2012, the Research Subcommittee heard testimony from university witnesses expressing concern about the growing toll of administrative burdens. After that hearing, I sent a letter to OMB as the agency sought to reform federal grants policies. The letter urged OMB to make changes to reduce administrative burdens in some of the same areas addressed in the board's report. While the OMB has not adopted these recommendations in full, I do feel that substantive progress has been made, and I hope that we can continue to address these matters moving forward. I look forward to working with research groups, the university community, science agencies, and other interested parties to identify and act on additional opportunities for reform. Although this committee cannot solve all the problems associated with administrative burdens, we do have an important role to play in working on and highlighting these issues. Both the America Competes Reauthorization Act of 2014 and the First Act, as mentioned by Chairman Bouchon, include language that would establish a working group under the National Science and Technology Council to make recommendations on how to harmonize, streamline, and eliminate duplicative federal regulations and reporting requirements. I am interested to hear the witnesses' thoughts on these legislative proposals. I'm also interested in hearing from the witnesses about how other legislation, such as the Data Act, which has just been enacted, and the Grant Act, which has been proposed, would affect administrative burdens for researchers. Finally, I'm interested in hearing about the progress that is already being made to streamline and harmonize administrative tasks. For example, I know that federal agencies have been working on harmonizing the grant proposal process and progress reporting requirements. Additionally, I understand that agencies have started exploring ways for researchers to submit only the information needed for the initial peer review phase, and then requiring administrative information from the researchers only if the proposal is likely to be awarded. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses about these efforts and other proposals that can help reduce the administrative burden for researchers. In closing, federal agency and institutional requirements have been put in place to protect human participants and animal subjects in research, ensure integrity in the research enterprise, and eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. There's no question that we need to have these requirements in place, but there's room to make changes to the implementation of these requirements. We must strike the right balance that both protects our research enterprise and enables scientists to spend more time on their important research. I look forward to the witness testimony today, and I thank you for being here, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Dr. Lipinski, I appreciate your opening statement. If there are other members who wish to submit additional statements, opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Dr. Arthur Bienenstock, Chairman of the Task Force on Administrative Burden at the National Science Board. Dr. Bienenstock is also a Professor Emeritus of Photon Science, Special Assistant to the President for Federal Research Policy, and Director of the Wallenberg Research Link at Stanford University. Our second witness is Dr. Susan Wyatt Sedgwick, Chair of the Federal Demonstration Partnership and President of the FDP Foundation. Dr. Sedgwick is also an Associate Vice President for Research and Director of the Office of Sponsored Projects at the University of Texas at Austin. At least you didn't have to drive from Austin here, right? Well, that's good. Our third witness is Dr. Gina Lee Glauser, the Vice President of Research at Syracuse University's Office of Research. And again, thank you so much for taking the tremendous effort to drive all the way down here from Syracuse. We really appreciate it. Our final witness is the Honorable Allison Lerner, Inspector General at the National Science Foundation's Office of Inspector General. Let me just say that I especially appreciate your presence here today, Ms. Lerner. I'm aware that your father's not well. And I want you to know that I'll keep him and you and your family in my prayers. So thank you. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. It is the practice of the Subcommittee on Oversight to receive testimony under oath. If y'all would all now please stand and raise your right hand. Hope no one objects to taking the oath. You do object to taking an oath? Oh, okay. Very good. Very good. Well, then, do you solemnly swear or affirm to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Okay, you may be seated. Let the record reflect that all the witnesses participating have taken the oath. I now recognize Dr. Birkenstock for 5 minutes. Sir, you're recognized. Let me remind all the witnesses that we're going to have votes this morning, and so if you could, please try to limit your comments to 5 minutes. Your written testimony will be placed in the record, but if y'all could try to watch the clock and make sure that if you can, as much as possible, just adhere to the 5 minutes, I'd appreciate it. Dr. Birkenstock.
Chairman Brown and Bouchard, ranking members Maffei and Lipinski, and members of the subcommittees, I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today on streamlining the red tape that is slowing the pace of scientific research. While this is a topic with which I have been engaged for many years as a former Associate Director for Science at OSTP and Vice Provost for Research at Stanford, I am here today representing the National Science Board, which is an independent advisor to Congress and the President. The Board's Task Force on Administrative Burden recently completed a report on reducing investigators' administrative workload for federally funded research. The Board created this task force because our scientists are dealing with heavy administrative workloads that interfere with the effectiveness of our nation's research enterprise, as indicated by successive federal demonstration partnership surveys. This committee heard this concern voiced before at its hearing 2 years ago on the National Academy's report on research universities and the future of America. I'd like to thank this committee for your sustained attention to this issue, including through Section 302 of the First Act that would require the creation of a high-level interagency, intersector committee to harmonize regulations across agencies. This is recommended in our report as well. The Board's report is available on our website, and I have a number of copies available here today, so I will highlight only a few key points in my oral remarks. First, I want to emphasize that the NSB is absolutely committed to the principle that research must be conducted with integrity, adherence to standards, safety, and full accountability. Administrative compliance requirements are needed to ensure this. However, it is equally important that we achieve these goals without creating unnecessary burdens. Second, while regulatory requirements add to the workload of many stakeholders, including NSF program officers and university administrators, our task force focused on research scientists and how we may be hindering their productivity. To prepare our report, the NSB issued an open request for information to the U.S. research community and held 3 roundtables across the country. Over 3,000 researchers and research administrators provided us with feedback. We also consulted with a major organization studying research administration and burden issues, including accrediting organizations for human and animal subject protections. The Board believes that by using stakeholder input to help identify and prioritize concerns, agencies like the National Science Foundation can provide an even better return on scarce taxpayer dollars. Let me now present our overarching findings and a few key recommended actions. First, the Board believes that we need to focus on the science. Proposals to the NSF include much information that is not critical to judging the intellectual merit and potential broader impacts of a proposal. Much researcher and reviewer time could be saved if materials like detailed budgets or postdoctoral mentoring plans were not submitted until after a project has been through merit review and deemed worthy of support. Second, we need a continued government-wide push to streamline regulations. For instance, the Federal Demonstration Partnerships payroll certification pilot may help us to reduce the burden associated with effort reporting without reducing accountability. You may hear more on this from both the FDP and Allison Lerner as she and her colleagues are reviewing this pilot. The board and many universities are looking forward to their report and hope to learn from it. Third, we need to continue to push for harmonization and streamlining across the federal government. The OMB uniform guidance and the new research performance progress reports are steps in the right direction, but more needs to be done. For example, the research community perceives that federal audit practices are not applied in a uniform and consistent way. The board will try to facilitate discussions between the audit and university communities to address this. There will be ongoing challenges of this sort. This is why we recommend the establishment of a permanent high-level intersector interagency committee. Finally, the report recommends ways in which our universities might increase their efficiency and effectiveness as stewards of research and taxpayer dollars. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bienenstock. Next witness is Dr. Sedgwick. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Dr. Sedgwick. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Brown, Chairman Bucshon, Ranking Members Lipinski and Maffei, and honorable members of the Oversight and Science and Technology Subcommittees. My name is Susan Wyatt Sedgwick. I am chair of Phase 5 of the Federal Demonstration Partnership and also serve as president of the FDP Foundation. As you will note from my CV, I am an associate vice president for research and director of the Office of Sponsored Projects at the University of Texas at Austin. I appreciate your invitation to appear before you today to provide an overview of the FDP's involvement in efforts to reduce the administrative burdens facing institutions and principal investigators that receive federal funding to conduct scientific research while not compromising proper stewardship. The FDP began in 1986 as the Florida Demonstration Project, and as of October 1 of this year, we will have grown to membership of over 155 research institutions and 10 federal agencies as members of Phase 6. The National Academy of Sciences Government University Industry Research Roundtable serves as the neutral convener of the FDP. The FDP acknowledges the need for federal government to ensure transparency, accountability, and the efficient use of federal research funding. But the 26% cap on the reimbursement of administrative costs to universities has not kept pace with the growing regulatory burden. Since the imposition of the cap over 20 years ago, university research has been subject to over 80 new or significantly revised regulatory requirements. This does not include the extremely burdensome requirements associated with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act funding support. Almost 20 years ago, the FDP first surveyed federally funded faculty researchers to evaluate the Florida Demonstration Project's first demonstration of the expanded authorities, which allowed grantees to perform some actions, such as unilaterally extending final project periods for up to 12 months without prior federal agency approval. The results indicated that those expanded authorities saved significant time, much of which could be redirected toward actively conducting research. In 2005 and in 2012, the FDP conducted faculty workload surveys of principal investigators of federally funded research to document the continuing impact of federal regulations and requirements on the research process. The 2012 survey reached almost twice as many investigators as the first survey, accumulating responses from almost 13,500 principal investigators with active research grants funded by the federal government. The results from both surveys were astonishingly similar. Researchers estimated that an average of 42% of their research time associated with federally funded projects is spent on meeting administrative requirements rather than conducting active research. These findings mirror those of the NSB survey and suggest that whatever progress may have been made in reducing administrative burdens has been countered by the introduction of new requirements. The FDP's payroll certification demonstration is an example of how the FDP works to provide less burdensome alternatives to meeting regulatory requirements. With payroll certification, the focus shifts to certification cycles that coincide with project funding periods, so principal investigators spend much less time trying to translate the extrapolated percentages of effort that are inherent with the disconnect between effort reporting and accounting cycles and project funding periods. The Office of Management and Budget has published its uniform guidance, which combines the requirements of 8 long-standing OMB circulars, including those impacting universities. The Council on Financial Assistance Reform must be commended for their laudable work at combining requirements for diverse grantees. However, one size fits all doesn't fit anyone well. There are some positive changes in the uniform guidance, as outlined in my written testimony. It remains unclear whether the uniform guidance will offer any demonstrable relief, but it is clear that in some cases, certain requirements may exacerbate the administrative burdens that are already breaking the backs of universities and principal investigators. As an example, new procurement requirements more applicable to the government's acquisition of commodities may result in thousands of transactions for research supplies being delayed on average by 2 or more weeks at most institutions. The FDP is perfectly positioned to provide a forum and testbed for exploring possibilities that will benefit our nation's research viability while shaping a more efficient and effective research enterprise. I would like to close by expressing my sincere appreciation to the committee and Congress for the continued support of academic research and your proposal to consider a holistic approach to reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sedgwick. Now, Dr. Lee, Dr. Lee Glaus, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Brown and Buchan, ranking members Maffei and Lipinski, and distinguished members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the invitation to testify at this joint subcommittee hearing. It is both timely and important in light of the recently released reports on administrative burden. I will discuss the role and impact that federal research regulations have on Syracuse University and our principal investigators, and comment on select recommendations of National Science Board's administrative burdens report most relevant to SU. My remark will focus on 3 topics: the application process, research subjects protections, and progress reporting. Syracuse University is a member of the FTP, and we participated in its administrative burden surveys. With and through the FTP, we strive to put our limited resources to their best use in support of research. Time, perhaps, is the most precious resource of our faculty and staff, and we all share in the responsibility to identify and implement processes that efficiently and effectively allow us to achieve our goals of supporting research without compromising our accountability to sponsors' requirements, the safety and well-being of research participants, or the welfare of our nation and the environment. The question we are all grappling with is how best to achieve these ends. Complicating our collective efforts is the constrictions in federal support for research. As a consequence, Syracuse University faculty members are submitting greater number of proposals in order to just get one application funded. The success rates of the research programs to which SU faculty apply, including the NSF and NIH, are now in the single digits. So our faculty are spending considerable time rewriting applications for the next cycle. Disturbingly, there's likely no meaningful differences in quality or the potential impact between the funded applications and the next tier of non-funded applications. So in addition to the time lost for our researchers, the pace of innovation and of knowledge creation is delayed. This discouraging state of competitive funding also is having a chilling effect on our students. I'm passionate about supporting students from the group underrepresented in academy and STEM disciplines as you do. I have directly observed the stifling effect that the current funding environment is having on these students' career plans. Every day, they see their advisors cope with the stress caused by the uncertain funding environment and challenges in successfully achieving work-life balance, and so most are choosing to pursue non-academic career. This is a tragedy for research institutions that desperately need the diversity of thought and experience that these exceptionally talented individuals bring. The NSB has recommended a number of ways to streamline the proposal submission process. I support them and would suggest another. that research granting agencies be required to use the grants.gov portal or system like FastLane. Public Law 106-107, the Federal Financial Management Assistance Act of 1999, created the foundation of grants.gov. It expired in 2007, perhaps enabling the proliferation of new grant application systems. A second burdensome area for SU faculty pertains to adherence to regulations governing human and animal subjects. These regulations importantly protect the rights of research subjects and ensure that risks and benefits are assessed and managed appropriately. Human subjects research at Syracuse is predominantly social and behavior, and so is ordinarily of low risk. However, current federal regulations do not yet provide a clear framework to more efficiently oversee this lower risk research. SU supports the board's recommendations to address this issue, as well as the similar changes to animal use procedures. Lastly, I know the submission of a research progress report is often a pain point for my faculty. We look forward to the efficiencies expected from the federal-wide implementation of the Research Performance Progress Report. Like all new tools, we know that there will be hiccups along the way, but the willingness of our federal research sponsors to work collaboratively with FDP and grantee community to further enhance these reporting tools will go a long way to reduce administrative burden on our faculty. I'd like to close with a few remarks about the recently released Omni Circular. Syracuse, like other research institutions, is currently evaluating the impact of Circular's new provisions on our current policies and procedures. We view this as an opportunity to identify and implement re-engineered processes that would allow us to more efficiently and effectively use federal funds in support of research. We are also closely monitoring agency implementation of these regulations and hope that there will be very few deviations from the provision. I ask this committee's help in avoiding the introduction or enactment of new legislations that will result in additional grant-related requirements on agency and the grantee. I thank the committee for taking a leadership role on this important topic, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee Glaus. Now, Ms. Lerner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the National Science Foundation.
Is your microphone on?
Oh, sorry. Am I closer? Is this better?
That's better.
There
Thank
we go.
you.
All right. I appreciate the chance to discuss the National Science Foundation Office of Inspector General's perspectives on the National Science Board report, Reducing Investigators' Administrative Workload for Federally Funded Research, our audits of the Federal Demonstration Partnership pilots of effort reporting systems, and the comments our office provided the Office of Management and Budget during its creation of the Uniform Guidance on Administrative Requirements, Cost Principles, and Audit Requirements for Federal Awards. Because both the NSB report and the Uniform Guidance address the need for changes to the effort reporting process, I'll begin with that issue. Every year, billions of dollars in federal funds are spent for salary costs of individuals who work on federal grants. Labor effort reports are essential documents for ensuring accountability over grant funds, as they represent the main support for salaries and wages charged under those awards. Over the years, OIG auditors and investigators have repeatedly found that not all such charges are appropriate, and some are even fraudulent. My office has had numerous investigations involving university grantees that have failed to adequately track time and effort. The cases that have been resolved to date have resulted in criminal convictions, civil settlements under the False Claims Act, and government-wide suspensions and debarments. In many cases, those outcomes would not have been possible without effort reports. As part of the Federal Demonstration Project, labor effort pilots at universities' universities' payroll distribution systems are underway at 4 universities. My office and the HHS Office of Inspector General are auditing those pilots, and we hope to complete our work by the end of the calendar year. The NSB report on administrative burden identified effort reporting as a top area of concern and recommended that OMB identify a way for the piloted approaches to be used by universities and accepted by OIGs. We appreciate the fact that the report recognized the importance of having the pilots audited, and I look forward to discussing the results of those audits when they're complete. The NSB report also made findings about administrative burden resulting from financial management, noting several audit-focused concerns. It's unclear to me what the respondents meant when they indicated that auditors were exceeding requirements. Most grant-related audit work conducted by OIGs would use OMB circulars or the uniform guidance as criteria and be conducted in accordance with audit standards, which should contribute to consistency in audit approaches. I would be happy to facilitate a dialogue between the grantee and the IG communities to obtain greater insights on this issue. The report also urged universities to consider requiring receipts only for large purchases. While it's hard to see that requiring receipts for purchases made using federal funds imposes a substantial burden, the lack of such receipts would have an immediate and detrimental impact on both an institution's and an OIG's ability to detect and prosecute fraudulent purchases. Requiring receipts only for large purchases would not provide protection for the not infrequent situations where individuals make many small fraudulent purchases with grant funds that eventually add up to a great deal of money. Finally, to put the impact of audits in perspective, it's important to recognize that most institutions are not audited by OIGs on a regular basis. NSF funds approximately 2,000 universities, colleges, and institutions annually. Due to size and resource constraints, my office conducts fewer than 20 audits of such recipients each year. With respect to the uniform guidance, our office led an IG community working group that worked diligently to ensure that the right balance between reducing burden and maintaining accountability was struck. The OMB circulars include many tools essential for combating fraud, waste, and abuse. Using these tools, OIGs have identified situations where recipients have misused grant dollars and been able to pursue criminal, civil, and administrative actions to recover those funds. The feedback we provided to OMB highlighted the importance of maintaining and not diminishing or eliminating valuable tools such as effort reports, cost accounting standards and disclosure statements, certifications, and single audits. Unlike contracts, the federal government has little insight into how grant funds are used by awardees. It's therefore essential that tools like IG audits and single audits, which are used to ensure accountability over federal funds, remain robust and provide sufficient oversight. While we recognize the need for a reasonable amount of flexibility to limit administrative burden, acceptance of public money brings with it a responsibility to uphold the public trust. NSF awardees must never forget that they are spending the public's money and that they will be held accountable for using that money for its intended purpose. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Lerner. I thank you all for your testimony. So I really appreciate the witnesses being here today and testimony. Now, committee rules limits questioning to 5 minutes per member, and the chair at this point will open the first round of questions. So the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Birkenstock and Dr. Sedgwick, as you know, the National Science Board's recent report notes that there's been an increase in administrative and compliance requirements associated with federally funded research. However, the Federal Demonstration Partnership's recent survey noted that principal investigators spend 42% of the time on associated administrative tasks, as Dr. Sedgwick just told us. And that's the same as it was in 2005. Wonder about that. But it's an interesting piece of data. How can one claim an increase in administrative and compliance requirements that when that 42% figure has remained static since 2005? Dr. Sedgwick, why don't we start with you?
Efforts of my colleagues and the FDP to limit, after we had the first survey, we've really stepped up our efforts to really focus on removing the administrative burdens on our faculty. And an example of this, when the ARA reporting, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act requirements for reporting came out, we worked very hard at minimizing the input that we had to get from our faculty. And we took that on our chins by developing systems, electronic systems, and these were not minimal endeavors. And so I think that we've worked very hard to minimize those increases on our faculty, and quite frankly, we were surprised that the number was exactly 42%, but we were grateful that it had not increased.
That's just unacceptable. 42% to me is a tremendous regulatory burden. Dr. Birkenstock, what's your comments or answer?
I'm afraid my age shows here. I was a working scientist in the late 80s and early 90s, and there was a marked change in the administrative load after 821, the circular governing reimbursement of universities, was modified. That did away with much administrative support that we had as faculty. So when I say that it's increased relative to the situation that I faced as a scientist back in the late 80s and early 90s before that modification of 821. And it's markedly different now.
Okay. Well, for all witnesses, what do y'all consider to be an acceptable amount of time for researchers to spend on associated administrative tasks? We'll start with Ms. Lerner, and we'll go down.
I don't think that I could give you a strict percentage, not being a working scientist myself. Certainly 42% does seem like a great amount of time, but some of the activities are obviously highly important, ensuring the protection of human subjects and informing funders and the public about the progress of research are obviously very important factors.
So the IG office doesn't have any comment about that. Dr. Lee Glaus,
I would defer to people more involved in that process than me.
As an engineer, and practiced in both industry as well as NASA, now at the universities. I cannot just tell you percentages, but I think when we went into this discipline, we wanted to make an impact, and we wanted to make a contribution and innovating. And I think even 10% would be too much, but at the same time, understanding what is required and due diligence. And I think there are amicable compromise. What is really exacerbating the situation is funding levers. When you have to constantly looking out for where your next funding to support all your postdocs and graduate students and undergraduates, that I think that is a part of the exacerbation from our faculty members.
Okay, Dr. Sedgwick.
Since I'm representing the FDP, I don't want to, this has not been discussed, a particular number, but I do want to tell you that we know that it's not zero.
What's your personal percentage?
I think
what is a good compromise?
A reasonable goal would be to cut that in half. I mean, if we could get to 20%,
right.
If we could get down to 20% or so, I think that would be reasonable.
Okay, Dr. Birkenstock.
You know, the problem is that we're dealing with regulations that serve a real function. I don't have a number in mind. I think what we're going to have to do is just chip away and chip away at this. I was really pleased to hear Ms. Lerner propose that the audit community and the university communities get together. We're just going to have to chip away, and there's no magic bullet. We're just going to have to eat away at little things.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Birkenstock. My time has expired. Mr. Maffei, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I think this is a tremendously important hearing to have, so thank you again for that. I'd like to ask Dr. Birkenstock, so we've been talking about trying to get this cut, and yet I fear that this, the first act may add to the administrative burden. There are several changes to the merit review process that I think would lead to NSF having to develop new policies for peer reviewers and PIs. Could you speak a little bit to the potential impact of some of these changes in this bill should it become law? Would that add to it?
First of all, let me repeat my applauding the call for OSTP to form a committee to harmonize regulations. Harmonization is a key way to save researchers' administrative time. For that reason, I was a little surprised by the treatment of research misconduct. When I was at OSTP, it took me 3 years to get all the agencies to agree on a common definition of research misconduct and on common procedures for dealing with an allegation of research misconduct. So it was surprising to find in the same act a section that would completely deharmonize NSF from all the other agencies in the treatment of allegations of research misconduct. It would be particularly troublesome in a situation in which a paper was funded by both the NSF and the NIH, for example, and in which there was an allegation of research misconduct. Because NSF was a funder, the Inspector General would have a responsibility for dealing with the allegation. Because the NIH was a funder, the university would have the responsibility or initial responsibility with dealing with it. I think that section is going to create real problems for the community. Let me say what's more, that as Stanford's vice provost for research, I had to deal with allegations of misconduct. Some of them are really subtle. And I was fortunate that I could immediately call upon faculty members who had expertise in the field, because there was no way that I could figure out whether it was misconduct or two researchers trying to use research misconduct as a way of settling what should have been a scholarly argument. I think you're going to add to the burden of the IG, and we're going to have chaos.
Dr. Bienenstock, that's extremely helpful, and I hope we can, we passed it through committee, but I hope we can, before it becomes law, take a look at that to try to reduce as much as possible. I do want to get back to this point that was made by a couple of people, a couple of the testimony, though. We're doing with 42%. That's an estimate. Who really knows what the answer is, but way, way too high. I think we're all agreed on that. The issue, though, is that we can reduce the regulatory burden significantly. Let's assume we can. It's still the number of times you apply for the same grant proposal is going to increase the percentage of time that scientists are spending on paperwork. So again, I do, Dr. Lee Glauser, I'll ask you because you talk about the discouraging state of competitive funding. Is this burden, even if we're able to reduce it somewhat by just reducing the paperwork requirements, but is this burden of constantly having to reapply for funds, is that turning off young people to the sciences? Are you seeing an effect on that?
So I think, especially with the...
Turn on your microphone, please, ma'am.
Sorry. I think a greater number of students are thinking twice about going into academics. And I think what I'm really scared of is women and underrepresented minority students. They see their faculty hustling left and right and constantly working 24/7. And I hear from them, if I have to work like that, I'd rather do something else. And yet their idea of coming into university and trying to get a PhD was to teach. And they ended up working elsewhere. I had a number of exceptional underrepresented minority students going into industries, left and right, as well as the government labs.
Okay, thank you. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. McVeigh. Now, Dr. Buchan, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Brown. First, I'll make a comment about competitive funding. Obviously, there needs to be competition, and when you're funding, there's never going to be a time where 100% of people's proposals are going to be accepted for funding. And I think the question I have, is where do we strike that balance to make sure that we are funding basic science research from the federal level at the appropriate level that is not impeding the ability of the scientific community to actually make progress, but also not fund projects that clearly, in my view, are not in the national interest or are worthy of the taxpayer dollar. There's a very difficult balance there, and there's disagreement in Congress of where that balance is. I would think everyone would agree that it's probably a little. I would agree. I'll give my opinion that it's probably a little lower than it should be at this point and hasn't kept up. But the argument that always throwing more dollars into it without continuing to look at that balance, I think is something we need to be careful about. Because as a steward of the taxpayer dollar myself, we want to make sure that things are funded at the appropriate level but not wasting money. The other thing is anyone that's ever filled out FAFSA, if you have a college student, anybody ever filled that out, knows that there's reporting and then there's reporting. So my question is you know, there, to your point, Ms. Lerner, there's, and everyone else, there's valid reasons to have reporting when we're looking at getting federal dollars to fund projects. Does anyone see, I mean, I think areas to look at are making sure the reporting is reporting the appropriate things that need to be reported, but leaving out stuff that really has no impact on the grant proposal. And I'm hearing some of that's happening. But can anyone, Dr. Birkenstock, you want to comment on that first?
Well, we definitely propose that progress reports, annual progress reports, be limited to the pertinent scientific information and outreach information that is needed to assess progress, and that we strip away other aspects of it. Similarly, in proposal writing, we propose that initially the proposals be limited to those things needed to assess whether it's appropriate to fund the research, and only when the decision has been made that the research should be funded do we request the other information.
Anyone, Dr. Lee Glaus, or you want to comment on that?
Totally in agreement.
Because I think
we need to use it just in time.
I think this is a potential area where my personal view of hearing your testimony, that without limiting accountability, that there's some significant progress that can potentially be made to improve the situation. Ms. Lerner, do you have any comments on that?
No, I would certainly agree that progress could be made.
The other question, how much administrative workload faced by universities is due to federal agency requirements versus institutional requirements? And I'll talk with Dr. Lee Glaus, or maybe can comment on that first.
Now you're putting me on the spot here, and I think both. So part of, in light of the Omni Circular, we are reviewing our institutional policies that we have, and how do we meet the requirement, but how do we look into re-engineering rather than just comparing and how to meet the requirement to meet the Omni Circular. We wanted to have process improvement in mind. So we are looking in that way. Yes, we do have internal policies and procedures that we are very, very cognitive of, and we wanted to streamline those as well.
Dr. Sedgwick?
The focus at our universities is on mitigating risk. But I think that in the same way that teaching to the test is maybe not always the best way to educate, administering to the audit, which is what happens oftentimes in these situations, is not the best way to reduce the administrative burden. And I think that we all live in fear of audit findings. And so it's very true that sometimes we maybe overextend what we could do, and we are taking that same look at all of our institutions. But again, whenever you have change, we're all wondering what that's going to mean for future audits, because it's an uncertain future.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Bichon. Now, Dr. Lipinski. Got a lot of doctors up here as well as down there. So you have two physicians and a PhD.
I was
Dr. Lipinski.
Going to ask the chairman, not to refer to me as doctor, because I don't. The real doctors over there are people who actually heal people, and so I usually don't like to use a doctor for my PhD, especially if someone's looking for emergency help. But I do appreciate whoever just turned the air conditioning on. I do appreciate that help. I saw Dr. Birkenstock. You had your hand up there. I want you to continue. I think you had a comment on that last question.
I just wanted to say that universities do fear audits, and they fear and are often more conservative than federal government regulations would require. And that's why I think Ms. Allison's suggestion or pledge to seek a meeting between the universities and the audit communities is so important, and I think she deserves our praise for leading that effort.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for your comments on the some of those comments on some of the provisions of the First Act, and I know we had worked on the you had been helpful with comments when we did the last NSF reauthorization bill, and I appreciate your work there, and especially also the fact I'm a Stanford graduate, and much appreciated. I wanted to focus on the Omni Circular, which is scheduled to be implemented at the end of this year. I'd like to get everyone's thoughts briefly on the Omni Circular, and what are the areas in which it helps reduce administrative burdens the most, and does it address the leading concerns of the scientific community? What other issues remain unaddressed? So just sort of your a few comments, a couple comments from each of you on your on the Omni Circular and where you think this helps and where more might be done.
I'll be happy to address that. I've been very involved in looking at the uniform guidance and what the wins are for universities and what the areas are that we're most concerned about. The treatment of terminal pay as an indirect cost, which indirect costs are capped at our universities, will once again be another unfunded mandate. The manner in which we're going to have to compete our procurement actions that are $3,000 and above is going to be a significant burden and change for our institutions. And these are two examples of the types of changes in the uniform guidance that are going to require revision of systems and processes and policies that are outside of the purview of research administration offices. So, at each of our institutions, we're working across our campus to try to come up with implementation strategies for our own institutions. And as we understand it, we are not even going to see the implementation plans for the agencies, besides the National Science Foundations, perhaps until the date that the uniform guidance goes into effect. So it's rather hard for us to plan and our own implementations when we don't know how those might be different among agencies.
Beanstalk?
There was one feature that I really liked, and that is the ability to charge administrative time that is directly linked to the research to the contract itself. That was the way we did things prior to about 1991, and it meant that that one could get administrative help locally. That's an extremely important change. Let me explain why we're so stressed out over effort reporting, and it's almost a question of integrity. That is, suppose I have 2 grants and a new technique comes out. Well, I've got to study that technique as a PI and spend a fair bit of time deciding it. Is it applicable to Grant A? Is it applicable to Grant B? Now, suppose it isn't applicable to either. On the one hand, it would have been negligent of me not to study it and see if it was applicable. But then how do I charge that time to the 2 grants? Or suppose it is applicable. How do I charge the time that I spend teaching a graduate student about it? Is that teaching or is that research? So you put a scientist in a situation where he and she must affirm in detail how time is spent where one cannot do that with integrity. It's for that reason that we are so looking forward to the Inspector General's report on the payroll certification with the hope, we expect that there will be difficulties, but we hope that the IGs and OMB and the university community will find a way of making that method meet our needs and meet the needs of the auditing community.
Thank you. You see I'm out of time.
Thank you, Dr. Lipinski. By the way, my father-in-law was an agronomist, a tropical soil specialist at Purdue University, and he would argue with me all the time that the PhD was original doctor. So Anyway, let's say the next member is Mr. Johnson. I think you're still here. Mr. Johnson, you recognize for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the panel for being with us today. As I'm sure many of you know, Ohio State University is a major academic institution within my home state. Its continual and significant contributions to the scientific community and to the state of Ohio must be able to continue free of ineffective and burdensome administrative regulations. OSU has about 600 active subawards with multiple agencies at any one time, the vast majority of which are with other academic institutions to which federal government also makes direct awards. However, Ohio State, like many institutions of higher education, believe that it is required to subject subawardees to much higher levels of scrutiny than when federal agencies monitor awardees that have been funded directly. Many believe that these additional requirements on universities to monitor each other are a total waste of effort and resources. So for each of you, how can we improve this process of sub-recipient monitoring of grant subawards to alleviate this burdensome administrative process that's placed on these institutions? And I'll let any of you answer that would like to. Ms. Sedgwick. Dr. Sedgwick, sorry.
That's okay. My daughter is a physician, and she calls me a faux doctor.
She calls you mom, too, right?
Yes, she does.
There you go.
This is one of the areas of the uniform guidance that we as research administrators were disappointed, because we felt like that we could concentrate, if we got some relief in subrecipient monitoring of other institutions that are audited under the A133 standards, that if we could spend less time on our subrecipient monitoring for them, we could concentrate our efforts and spend our resources really looking at those subawardees who do pose a greater risk, foreign subawardees, small startup companies, or smaller institutions that maybe don't have that kind of annual audit scrutiny. So that's one of the things that we would have really liked to have seen in the uniform guidance.
Okay. Anybody else care to respond on that one? Okay. Well, you know, for Ms. Lerner, similar to the grant proposal findings and recommendations included in the National Science Board's recent report on reducing administrative burden, OSU has stated that many principal investigators have struggled with an increase in grant proposal resubmissions due to the continual development of more complex and detailed proposals, coupled with declining funding rates. So what steps has the NSF already taken to address these concerns?
I think probably that question might be better addressed to someone from the foundation proper. As the auditor or the independent body within the foundation, we don't have a role in determining what projects are funded and what the process is. So I can't speak directly to what the foundation has done there.
Okay. All right. Yes. Go right ahead.
The National Science, a section of the National Science Foundation is piloting a program of pre-proposals. And in that way, you can weed out about 50% and even more of the proposals are not likely to get funding. And these proposals, pre-proposals, are very short. So that reduces both the amount of time that the proposers spend on writing the proposals and also the amount of time that the reviewers spend. In response to that question, I have to say that this committee could do us a great deal of good if it would modify the authorization bill in a way. Presently, the authorization, the America Competes Act, requires that postdoc mentoring plans be included in the original proposal. We value very highly postdoc mentoring programs, but we believe that could be put off until we know that a proposal is likely to be funded. And we need legislation altered in order to achieve that.
Well, thanks for being very clear on that. I appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Now, Ms. Kelly, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. In the NSB report, the FDP survey and other recent reports, time and effort reporting is identified as a leading concern for researchers in terms of time spent on paperwork, while being a poor metric for the conduct of science. Can you elaborate on the nature of the concerns and what efforts are underway to try to simplify or mitigate the burden of this requirement? And anyone who wants to answer.
Okay, imagine, if you will, that you're a principal investigator in your office, your lab, and you're funded from different funding streams. You have your institutional duties, and then you have projects that don't have the same project period. And so in effort reporting, once or twice a year, we ask the faculty to look at those percentages that were individuals on their awards, their postdocs, their graduate students, related to your staff, how much time they spent. Did they actually spend the time that they were supposed to spend on those projects? Which that's all fine and good, but it's very confusing because it doesn't have a one-to-one correlation. Our payroll certification project has the certification for the specific project. So you're looking at that on an annualized basis, and it's just much easier for the faculty to look at it on a project-by-project basis versus in the whole.
Anyone else?
Part of the things that Art was pointing it out earlier, when you are doing the research, it really is very hard to compartmentalize whether it's a project A or project B or project C. Especially very active faculty members may have multiple grants and contracts, and it's not all from the federal government. It could be from the corporations as well. So it is very hard to, as Art pointed out, if you are finding something new, are we supposed to stop? As a researcher, curiosity is the best effort to go through in that process, and then trying to find it out, where do I dock at that time, whether it's with the graduate student or undergraduate or postdoc. So these are some of the inherent challenges in a research institution.
And as the auditor on the panel, I would just say that I'm not going to tell anyone that the current effort reporting system is perfect. It's not. And I think that things could be made better. But the thing to bear in mind is the amount of money that goes towards salaries each and every year. We looked at 2 years, FYs 12 and 13. NSF put about $11 billion into research funding. $4 billion of that approximately went to salaries. And so that's about 36% of the research funding in a year. So there needs to be some way of ensuring that money is spent appropriately.
So you're saying it's vital for accountability, yes, and you have examples of how
yes,
things have been,
absolutely,
grant funds have been misused. Is there a middle ground?
I think, that's the thing for us to discuss right now. And that's why our community has stepped up and offered to come in and audit these pilots. Because if there is a better way of doing things, we want to embrace that.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Kelly. And Mr. Collins, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses. I'm new to this committee, and I found this very interesting. By the way, I have participated in some CDC grants, so I know something about this, although not necessarily as you're talking about the professors. I guess, Ms. Lerner, I'm hearing a willingness of the IG to work with the universities, call it continuous improvement, to have that conversation.
Certainly we have to maintain auditor independence, but that doesn't, we should obviously be involved in a dialogue about accountability and about how to improve things. So I think there's a way of being involved in that conversation while maintaining the independence that we need.
Yeah, I mean, calling that balance, the IG's open to suggestions coming in, streamlining ways to make sure your auditors know taxpayer dollars are being protected and lessening the burden to the extent but you need to make sure taxpayer dollars are being properly spent.
We do. And what I hate to see happen sometimes is conversations get very far along without the audit community being included, and then people think solutions have been reached, and we have to come in and, rain on the parade. So it's better to be involved in the conversation early.
Now, what I'm hearing, the 26% overhead rate,
26%?
did I hear that from Dr. Sedgwick?
That was her recommendation as a kind of middle ground between, sorry.
The 26% is a cap that was imposed back in the 1990s on the ability for universities to be reimbursed for their administrative costs. And almost all research universities that belong to the FDP far exceed that cap.
So does that just go in as a plug number when they're doing it, and then you just say times 1.26, or?
The 26% is the administrative portion of our facilities and administrative costs, and it's capped. And then we negotiate our negotiated rate, which is then applied.
Right. So that's really not audited so much. That's just an automatic slipped-in number. Yeah, okay. But if it was what you were, Dr. Sedgwick, suggesting perhaps that didn't cover everything, for every dollar that we increase, that would be, to refer to Dr. Lee Glauser, a dollar then not spent somewhere else. I mean,
that's right.
You can't have it both ways. It's called balance. I look at it that it's probably not a bad balance.
Well, in my my written testimony, I talk about the fact that the administrative burdens on our faculty are exacerbated by the fact that we are trying to, in our offices, absorb as much of the administrative burden as we can. But every time we have to take on a new regulation, then those are dollars that we have to spend on the administrative requirements versus just helping our faculty with their administrative tasks.
No, understood. So, Dr. Lee Glauser, you have many principal investigators. I have to assume they don't all have the same hit rate when they're applying. They don't have the same amount of time. Has Syracuse have you gone to really try to deep dive, why is this investigator hitting 40% and this one 3%, and why does, in other words, are you looking for efficiencies and suggestions? Because any improvements you can make, you're helping yourself.
So it differs significantly by the agency to agencies. So if some of our faculty are targeting defense agency, ONR, OSR, or ARO, the importance of having a relationship with the program director is that important. And I think it's a very aligned with almost like a proposal type of action. Many of our programs are done with the white papers, which is 1 to 5 pages. And you have a nod, go, no go. Once you have a go, success rate is very high. So the faculty members who are doing more defense-related projects, their success rate is much higher, typically, than faculty members who are seeking funding from the National Science Foundation as well as the National Institutes of Health.
So you do, I mean, it would make sense to try to help your investigators do better. The better their hit rate, the less, and
exactly.
It's common sense. But
we would like to have
help
our
yourself
faculty,
again, yeah.
Yep. We would like to have our faculty writing one proposals and getting that one funded, if it is all possible. Yes.
I think we all would. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We're going to switch out here again real quickly. We're having a little discussion here about doing a second round. We have a lot of questions. I know other members do. I have also. We also have votes on the floor, and we have conflicting idea about when we're going to have votes. So I think we're going to go ahead and start a second round of questioning, if y'all don't mind. Also, we're going to, when we get through with this, we'll present any other questions to y'all for the record, so we call them QFRs. So if y'all don't mind, be
anticipating questions from the members of the committee, both committees, for further questioning. So, Ms. Lerner, the Council of Inspectors General for Integrity and Efficiency's response to the Office of Management and Budget's uniform guidance, or omni-circular, it states that it is important to strike the appropriate balance between reducing burden and maintaining proper accountability. Can you help illustrate what an appropriate balance looks like? For example, what do inspectors general need to see at a minimum in order to be able to ensure accountability and transparency with federal grants without impinging upon a researcher's extremely valuable time to do their research?
Thank you. Both my written and my spoken testimony mentioned several tools that are extremely important to IGs. We've talked a lot about effort reporting. Another area that we haven't spent as much time to focus on that I think does and has served to fight back some of the burden on researchers is single audits. Single audits were put in place back in the 80s, and what a single audit does is it is a pretty high-level audit looking at internal controls and financial expenditure, financial management within a recipient. And what prior to the creation of a single audit, an entity that could be funded by multiple federal agencies, all of whom would have the need to audit, and they could all go in at the same time. If you receive funding from 5 different agencies, you could have 5 different sets of auditors walking in simultaneously or after each other looking at the same things. So what the single audit did was say, we're going to do this once, at this very high level, and spare some burden there. And so maintaining the integrity of the single audit process is very important to IGs and, to institutions and other folks who rely on the information there. So maintaining a robust single audit process, having strong cost principles that clearly delineate what are allowable costs, so that people, so that there's some clarity both for auditors and for folks who are incurring costs. All of those are important things to IGs.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Lerner. Dr. Birkenstock, the board has suggested that agencies and institutions consider requiring receipts and justifications only for larger purchases. Conversely, the NSF-OIG makes a compelling case for requiring investigators to obtain and retain receipts for all purchases. Can you please elaborate on your justifications for the board's suggestion, including at what amount you would require receipts?
As I understand it, federal regulations allow one to not submit a receipt for expenditures under $75. And yet, many institutions are required by, and federal regulations allow, for instance, a researcher who's traveling to use a per diem reimbursement rather than providing receipts for each little meal and thing of that sort. Yet many states require receipts for every little transaction and don't allow the use of the per diem rules that so ease things for with the federal government. So we were looking primarily at the states there that don't allow per diem. That's my memory in that recommendation.
Okay, at what level, though, receipts would you require? Just a number.
I think the $75 is
appropriate.
Yeah.
Okay, Ms. Lerner, can you please provide us with the IG community's perspective on this issue?
I think I was fairly clear in my written testimony, speaking for myself, and I think probably reflecting the views of my community. We rely on receipts, and just because an expense is small doesn't mean that there can't be many small fraudulent expenses. Mm-hmm. So ensuring that if a threshold was set at a higher than 75%, we would have some challenges. And as I noted in my written remarks, we had one very creative person who made 3,800 small purchases that added up to over $300,000 of fraudulent purchases. So we do need to have receipts to help us make cases like that.
That's a lot of pizza and hamburgers.
It was, and she subsidized. She really liked to tailgate for a university other than the university that she worked at. And that did not go over well.
Very good. My time's expired, Mr. Maffei. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Sedgwick, I was struck by the fact that both the 2005 and 2012 FDP faculty workload surveys found that principal investigators reported in both surveys spending an average of less than 60% of their time on active research. So the scientists spending less than 60% of their time on science. Can you comment on what policies, if any, because I know you said there were things put in place to try to reduce the workload, but then there were things that added to it. Was it mostly the Recovery Act? Of why we didn't get improvements in the administrative workload between those two times?
The results were quite often in the the research compliance areas. For those researchers that utilized animals, or those researchers that used human subjects, participants, those were very high burdens for them. And so that's what we looked at, is not only was it prevalent across all researchers, but what were the big pressure points for researchers in general. And so if you had human subjects participants, or if you had animal use and care to deal with, those were very high, and a lot of that is regulatory driven. And then just the financial management, the effort reporting remains to be high across all sectors, because that touches all faculty.
Thanks. I think that's very helpful. Somebody made the comparison between applying for research grants and getting through that administrative burden and sort of teaching to the test, and that part of the challenge is that researchers are designing their applications more to sort of teach to the way that's done. And I don't know, Ms. Lerner, whether you were able to comment on that at all, but I'm curious as to whether you think that's true and how can that be reduced.
I think the expression was that they were trying to teach to the audit with the idea of avoiding any possibility of a negative audit finding. And I know we're scary people, and I say that in jest, but I recognize that an audit that question costs and tries to take money back from an institution is a frightening thing to have to deal with. What I would say is, really it's not the audit. We audit to criteria, and the criteria come out of previously the OMB circulars and now the uniform guidance. And so if we can have a better understanding of and set policies and procedures that are harmonized with the criteria that the federal government has, then there shouldn't be a problem with the audit down the road. And I think what I've heard some of my colleagues here referring to is that sometimes standards are raised beyond what the federal standards require in an excess of caution. And if that can be avoided, that might be an area of improvement.
Dr. Sedgwick, you seem to...
Well, I'm the one that said that we administer to the audit. And by that I mean, keep in mind that the inspectors general for the federal agencies are not the only auditors that are auditing us. Ms. Lerner has alluded to our A133 single audits, and those are conducted by our state, run by our state audit offices for those of us that are state institutions. And so it's not just inspectors general that we're concerned about. I will give you an example. In the uniform guidance, there is much more burdensome subrecipient monitoring requirements. And we already feel that at our institution, and I think some of my colleagues who we have, how you make subawards to, feel like that we are pretty risk averse. Well, our state auditors have already told us they want to talk to us about increasing what we do at our state institutions, and that's really concerning for me, and I think that that's what we're all thinking is coming out of the uniform guidance, is we don't know where not just the inspectors general but our state auditors are going to take this.
That's really helpful. I'm curious, Dr. Lee Gauser, I'll ask you if you have a thought on this, but I'm curious as to whether you think that these requirements put any bias in terms of the kinds of universities, the sort of home universities or colleges that, for instance, you mentioned state. Are state institutions having to deal with more of this and therefore biased against? Do the sort of the huge traditional names, are they helped? Or the smaller colleges, if you're from there, they don't have the resources to support scientists as much? Do you detect any of that? Is there?
I think Syracuse University as a private institution, we are not a state institution, but we have the same burden.
Right.
We receive funding from the state as well as the federal and different agencies, so we have the same burden.
I know my time is up, but Ms. Lerner, do you ever detect any sort of? Are you concerned at all about different? The nature of the institution?
Over the years, the IG community has found problems at at every size institution that you can imagine, from the biggest names to the smallest. So there's no guarantee that size prevents problems. What I would say is in larger research institutions like the University of Texas, my alma mater, and a lovely place, you do have people like Dr. Sedgwick who are able to provide support and ensure an environment where you're more likely to have controls. That may be difficult to replicate at smaller institutions, and certainly when you have small businesses that are receiving funding.
Thank you. I thank the chairman for his obliging me. I think this is all very, very valuable.
Certainly, gladly. No problem. I've always tried to give lots of leeway. Dr. Bichon, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go a little bit different direction. I think Dr. Birkenstock, mentioned about an intriguing thought that sometimes misconduct allegations are done because there's an academic argument for competitive purposes, and we all know that the academic environment is really hyper-competitive. My question is I want to answer, see what people's insight is that what happens when those things happen within your own university? This may go to the university folks. What are the repercussions of that when that is found to be the case, where it's an academic argument, and in a competitive environment people have made accusations? And then, Ms. Lerner, maybe you can address what implications that may have on the future ability of the person making the accusation that's found to be false, on their further ability to ever get federal funding ever again. Because in my mind, if they do that, I wouldn't want to give them another taxpayer dollar ever. Or we've discussed this at the committee, or have a time frame where you would maybe, there'd be some forgiveness there. You want to follow up on that, Dr. Birkenstock? I mean, how significant do we think that a lot of the stuff we're spending time on within the university is actually related to academic competition and not related to actual fraudulent behavior by researchers?
Let me say that approximately half of the cases that I had to deal with as vice provost were of that nature. Okay? On the other hand, I have to say that it was pretty subtle. That is, the process is first you determine, is the allegation one that should be dealt with under the definition of falsification, fabrication, or plagiarism? Then you do an inquiry. And in both of those cases, the inquiry said we better do an investigation. So it is subtle. And then in the end, when we got the senior faculty together to really look at it carefully, it was decided there isn't research misconduct here. It really is an argument that should be settled in the literature. Now,
so is there a reporting requirement? Say an institution finds that within their own institutional investigation. Is there a requirement to inform the federal government that who made the allegation in the first place and what the outcome was?
No, I believe in circumstances like this we don't report. And remember, the person who made the allegation had a real reason for doing it. And we wouldn't
Well, maybe
have
they
gone
did.
beyond the inquiry stage if we didn't think there was enough justification to go into the investigation. So it's not as if you really want to stop these things, because in some cases there is real misconduct, and you're supposed by the rules to keep these things confidential unless there is a real finding of research misconduct.
Ms. Lerner, you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I would just say if NSF funding is involved, we are supposed to be informed even at the inquiry stage, because we do defer the initial inquiry and investigation is conducted by the institution. And if there is a determination that no investigation is warranted, we're informed of that. But what the institution is doing is looking at the interest of the institution, and we look at research misconduct and allegations from the perspective of the funding agency. And sometimes we will look at the inquiry and or investigation and decide that additional work is necessary. And we do go on and do that. It's not often. Usually we can rely on the determinations that are made by the funding, by the institutions. But in instances, and we've had some prominent ones where we don't think that sufficient work has been done, we go in and do more. And then we make recommendations to the director intended to protect the
I want to give both the doctors from the universities, there was some surprise about your initial part of your statement. So Dr. Lee Glauser, first, can you comment on that?
Yes.
And then, with your indulgence, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Sedgwick.
So it's my understanding that during the inquiry stage within the institution, we do not have to report to NSF when it goes into the investigation. So we are very careful as to how we are wording what we are doing.
I agree.
Yeah.
We are required to report when we start the investigation stage, and then the results of our investigation.
Mic's not on, Mr. Lerner, Ms. Lerner. Your mic's not on.
There we go. See, I'm wrong twice. Can't even turn the mic on. But sometimes allegations come to us and we send them to the institution for inquiry. So that's what I'm speaking of. In those situations, we're already aware. In other instances, we are not aware of them until they get through the inquiry stage. So.
Okay, because this issue actually seems very important to me because, like I said, there is a discussion on when you fraudulently use taxpayer dollars, or you accuse someone of fraudulently using taxpayer dollars and they weren't, what the repercussions of that are. And so thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Dr. Buchan. As a practicing physician, I've seen the burden that's placed upon medical practitioners by the federal government, and it's markedly driven up the cost of the practice of medicine. It drives up the cost of insurance. It drives up the cost for all of us, society as a whole, because of the heavy burden of the federal government that comes from Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So this regulatory burden on all scientists, whether it's a researcher in a university or whether it's a private researcher or whether it's even medical providers that are working, the cost in time, energy, which of course are extremely valuable, as well as the financial cost are huge. And I appreciate y'all being here today to help elucidate some of the issues that y'all face. By the way, for those of y'all that are not from the South, y'all is singular for all y'all, which is the plural folks, or y'all could be plural itself, so it is singular and plural. So, but I greatly appreciate y'all being here today. And it's great testimony from each of you. I appreciate certainly all of y'all have made some personal sacrifice in your valuable time to come here and give us your testimony. And personally, I greatly appreciate it. And then others have even made some other types of sacrifices, driving a long way from Syracuse, New York, down here. And then Ms. Lerner, again, I'm sorry for your father's health problems, and I greatly appreciate your personal sacrifice to come. know that there was some question whether you could attend or not because of that. And I will keep you and your family and your dad in my prayers. But all of the committee members may have, or some of us may have, further questions for each of y'all. And I would appreciate a very rapid response to that. Members are reminded that you have a couple of weeks because the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments or for those written questions from members. And then if y'all would please get your responses back as expeditiously as possible so that we can go ahead and close this record. And if you have any suggestions of how we can get this burden off of our scientific community so that we can do science instead of fulfill the regulatory burden that the federal government has placed upon y'all, and also give Ms. Lerner and her compatriots in IG offices across this country the resources that they need to do their job, and so we all have to be held responsible and accountable, and so that's what Ms. Lerner and her office is all about. So if y'all could let us know, Ms. Lerner, if you could help us too also, I'd appreciate that. So thank all y'all for your valuable testimony. I thank members for your great questions, and the meeting, this hearing is now adjourned.